Hello, everyone. So, in celebration of 100 subscribers, I have decided to make a tier list for Early Age Dominions 5. This is my own opinion. I don't claim to be a almighty objective god when it comes to these ratings. This is from my own personal experience. I have not played all these nations, but I have at the very least played against them, so I'm definitely not an expert on all these nations, but I will try to back up my feelings with reasons. Okay, so to start, we're going to start at the very top and work our way down to the bottom. So, what is the best nation in Dominions 5 Early Age? It's not a nation I actually like at all, but it's got to be Pangaea. Early Age Pangaea has amazing sacred units. Very, very good units. They get free spawn constantly. Their commanders are extremely killy. They're super thuggable. They have exceptional magic. They have good blood access too. Their normal forts are primitive, but they can just conjure bramble forts anyway. Also, most of their units are stealthy, so it's got basically all the positives of an elf nation. The game plan of Pangaea Early Age is so brain dead simple that anybody could execute it. I guess I should clarify. Basically what these letters indicate are how strong the nation is. The higher you are, the better you are. And also the closer you are to the left, the better you are within that tier. So for example, Pangaea is going to be the king of S tier. I think every nation above C are very competitive, and you can absolutely win with those nations. I think C nations are still definitely winnable, but because they have a lot of terrible downsides, it'll make it a lot harder for you to actually pull off a win. And D nations are just so cataclysmically bad that really the only way you can win is if your opponents let you. So anyway, Pangaea number 1. Next in S tier is the most recently released nation, Ubar. Ubar has very high fire, very high air. They can get really high water and earth with their summons, and they also get blood and death from their summons, which as far as I'm concerned means they get access to the most important paths of magic in very high numbers. When their pretender wakes up, they get ludicrously broken sacreds and a super combatant chassis. Their genies are unseen, stealthy, glamored, flying, ethereal ghosts with great stats. It's just ridiculous how good they are. They also have ghouls, which are, I think, a busted unit. I think they're broken. Ubar is weak to salt. I don't know if that's even a real negative, but they have that as a trait. I've never seen it used in practice. I feel like the salt addition is a greater nerf to other ghost nations and not really to Ubar. Granted, Ubar, much like Nabat, is slow to get going. Before their pretender wakes up, they're kind of vulnerable. Camel Riders are decent units, but they're not that great. Ubar can definitely get rushed down badly. So the next is Machlin. Machlin, with a Hellbless, has game-breaking sacreds and summonable troops. They get lots and lots of blood. They also get very high fire, astral, nature, water. And because all of that stuff can be in a communion, they can get it to even higher levels. For the era, their troops are very decent, undercosted even, a lot of them. Their sacreds are still great. Machlin is just a fantastic nation, and I think I'm going to play them next. Them or Xibalba. I'm going to play one of those two because they seem really, really cool. I don't really have anything bad to say about Machlin. The next, another nation I loathe is Valheim, who have, again, following the trend, game-breaking sacreds and really high blood access, also really high air access. And they can forge into death, earth really high, or even higher air or fire, so they get basically all the important paths of magic in really high levels. Also, their elves sneak everywhere, insane map move, super mobile. I mean, really, their biggest problems are their units are expensive. Also, their off-cap research is very expensive, too. But still, I think Valheim is definitely worthy of one of the best nations in the game. You can roll people with your Vanheers, and most nations can't stop you. they just can't do anything about it. You just lose. And that's sort of a trend that all of these nations have, is you can just run over people with your units and crush them within the first 12 turns. And there's not much counterplay. And then the king of A tier, which I basically, I mean, look, it's Fimoria, all right? I mean, Fimoria probably should be an S tier. They don't have blood, but they get really high death, really high air. As far as I'm concerned, outside of blood, those are the most important paths of Magic to have. Lets you do crazy thug stuff, and Fimoria's got some really bonkers commanders. I mean, the Fimorian king is just insane. They have great infantry. They even have elves built in. They've got a little elfing potential. Their sacreds are good. The main problem is their afflictions, but still, even with that RNG thrown in, they're fantastic. Extremely killy. They can sail, they can go underwater and beat down the tiny, pathetic water nations with their vastly superior units. They even get a little water on their commander, so they can summon water elementals with the best of them. And their heroes are also kind of busted. Like, I mean, I don't really know what else to say. Their heroes are just ridiculous. The only reason I wouldn't put Fimoria in S tier is because I don't think they're as brain dead easy to pull off a win with as all of these nations are. I think all these nations, you can win the game a lot easier, and you don't really have to outplay your opponents that much because your nation just is so strong. Whereas Fimoria, I think, requires a little more tact, a little more finesse, but that's not to say they're not ridiculously strong. Any nation with death and air in it is just pretty much automatically going to be great. And so following that trend, we have Helheim, which is realistically very similar to Fimoria. Excellent cap-only mages. They've got elves. They've got fantastic sacreds. They've got death and air. The problem is death just kind of isn't as good as blood. It's still really fantastic. Don't get me wrong. Death is an amazing path of magic, but it's not as busted as blood. Also, much like Vanheim, everything in Helheim is expensive. Their off-cap research is still expensive, even though the Van Heers is for some reason a little cheaper. But they're excellent. Following that, we should see Sarumadia next, who have great sacreds. Their magic is very nice. They do have blood. Like, Vanheim also doesn't have amazing blood searching, blood hunting capabilities, but they have other stuff that compensates for it. Sarumadia still has really good stuff, though. They've got a lot of different cavalry options. They've got a 35 gold fortune teller, the soothsayer. I think he's Astral 1 most of the time, too, which is just, I mean, that's so unfair. That's so ridiculously unfair to have such a unit. And here we have Xibalba, big blood. Big dumb blood nation. It's got the same busted sacred summons from Machlin. The problem is Xibalban troops, while way more mobile, are way more squishy. So expansion with early age Xibalba can be very hard. So on that same note, you have Baratos, which has blood. It doesn't have very good sacreds, though. The sacreds are kind of meh. They're decent. Nothing really stands out about them. They only have one attack, and they're size 3, so you can only fit 2 per square. That's very poor attack density. I mean, compare that to freaking Vanheim, and most of the Baratos troops actually suck. Poor troops, but great blood, and just overall good magic. Strictly speaking, you'd think Hinnom should be better than Baratos, having better blood, better troops, but the problem is with Hinnom, just everything is really expensive, and unless they start winning early, it's very, very difficult for them to catch back up because everything is so freaking expensive. Even their bottom of the barrel Blood 1 mages are like 200 gold. Sorry, 250 gold for your Cohen, which is just ludicrous. Not to mention that all of their important mages are going to be killing your population and causing unrest, lowering your gold. But even with those terrible downsides, Hinnom is still a great nation thanks to, as mentioned, really fantastic sacreds, really good units, and like super combatant tier thug chassis. The Melkart is insane. And the final mention for A tier is Agartha. They have a lot of access to a lot of really good summons. So they have a lot of different ways to efficiently spend their gems. but they also have really strong magic. They get some extra Earth Bless points. Middle Age Agartha, I think, is much better than Early Age, but Early Age is still very good. They've got Holy Three Priests, so they can Throne Rush. Great Olms are, I think, a very strong Sacred unit. Really, their major problems are their troops. Their generic troops are bad. And now we're at the top of B tier. So to start that, we have Calum. Calum being mobile, having good mages, having a lot of different diverse magical summons they can get, opening up further magical paths. Their expansion is pretty easy, but after their mid-game power spike, they fall off late. You have Marverni, which is a really cool nation. Their troops are not actually very bad. They have a lot of different unit choices to work with. They can get Berserkers really cheap and easy, which I think is very valuable. Marverni has like a 45 gold Astral 1 Fortune Teller, so kind of the same thing as Sorrow. It's like, wow, that's such an unfair mage. It almost makes you think, why does Sarumadia get to pay 10 gold less for their almost identical commander? Their druids are pretty nice. They can get high in a lot of different paths, thanks to Astral. The problem is just like their paths of magic outside of Astral aren't very special. Like they're all good. Marverni's just like a really solid nation. So next we have the highest rated water nation, Therados. So Therados is a Dom-killing, probably death scale running water nation, and I mean at that point you might as well just hop in the grave. You'll never get as many provinces as real land nations. Telkine heroes are insanely strong super combatant chassis. Having ghost units is really great. You force your opponents to take magic weapons, or else you just blow them out completely. Their ability to research and tech up is very, very great. The biggest problems for Therados are dealing with other water nations, because you just can get run over by them. But that said, I think Therados has maybe not the best shot of beating other land nations in a straight 1 versus 1, but I do think they have the best ability to scale. So next we have Niflheim, which is a favorite of mine. Scrotty are just, they open up so much potential with turbo communions, and they've got good magic, they've got good death, they've got good blood, and they even have Astral too. So you'd think like, well, why aren't they higher? And it's mainly because their troops are just so bad. The Jotun Herdman costs 50 gold, and you get a guy that's pretty good, but is he as good as a Vanir? And then we have another blood nation, Lanka. Lanka has great blood, they've got death, but their death kind of sucks because they don't get the same good long dead that other nations do. I mean, they do sometimes, but also occasionally they just get Machaca's, and those guys are awful. But still, Lanka has good blood, so if a game goes late, Lanka can always scale into late game and power up off that. But their base troops are garbage. Their base troops are completely dumpster tier. Basically, if you apply any pressure to Lanka and they have to respond and they're prevented from scaling, there's very little chance that they can win. So next is Archaecephaly. Archaecephaly has very high Astral, and from that Astral magic, all the elemental paths, and they also have pretty high nature too. The Oread is a excellent mage. They have really good sacreds too with Wind Riders. Really the only reason they aren't higher is because humans suck. You need buffs to make them competent. So after Archaecephaly we have Machaca. Early Age Machaca is definitely superior to their Middle Age variant. They have a lot of different troops of varying quality. They have really high fire and nature magic. The problem is that is not a very useful combo. Like, you can get flaming arrows, you can get relief, howl, but it just really doesn't hold a candle to the deluge of options that death or blood gives you. Now, Machaca does have death as well. Anyway, I'm rambling about Machaca way too much. Basically, like, they've got decent mages, they've got okay troops that you can buff with earth magic, which is always nice, but they don't have amazing mages, they don't have real thugging, like, superb mages. All of those, I mean, they kind of do, but they're cap only and they're slow to recruit. Their sacreds are good, but they're not that good. They're sort of the same as Baratos' sacreds. They're just kind of like a big guy with a stick. And then Early Age Statists. Statists has a very simple game plan, and they can execute it very well. You get skeletons, you get foul vapors, you have level 3 priests. And that's all you need. You do those things, and you do them very well. You don't really do anything else. Statists does death, which is the only reason they're in B tier is because they can do death, and death is just such a powerful path of magic that makes them that good. And then rounding out the B tier is Urmor. Early Age Urmor is a very generic nation that can do all magic except blood, which is unfortunately the most important path of magic, so the fact that they can't do it is crippling. Their troops are fine for humans. Their sacreds are quality, and that's really all there is to say about it. Like, they can get themselves into communion and get really high death. They've got holy threes. They can get high fire, but it's like, okay, what are your thug options? What can you teleport around to stop armies from raiding you? How do you beat mass Ocelotl spam? How do you beat white centaur spam? Well, you gotta rely on like Soul Slay and stuff. And that's the end of B tier. This is not really to discredit any of these nations by saying they're B tier. I think again, you can absolutely win a game if you are better skilled than your opponent with all of these nations, or even if you're equivalent skill with your opponent. I don't think playing any of these nations handicaps you in such a way that winning the game is now impossible. So the king of the trash can is Early Age Ulm, but Early Age Ulm is kind of just like a poor man's version of MA Ulm. They have expensive troops that are more killy than MA Ulm's troops, but they're not nearly as gold efficient. I would say more than half of them are trap choices. Like, basically anything that's not a Steel Maiden or a Forest Warrior is kind of garbo. The Axe Warrior is great too, but you get what I'm saying, right? It's like you have a small handful of Early Age Ulmish troops that are really strong because of their attack density, but that's it. That's your one trick that your troops have, is they have a lot of attacks. They don't really have anything else going for them. Their stats aren't that great. Their magic resistance is poor. Their protection is poor. Their morale isn't very good, and they're all expensive, with the exception of the Axe Warrior. So you've got somewhat decent troops that are really killy, but basically Early Age Ulm troops shine with buffs on them. But again, you need to get buffs. Okay, so now you need something to complement your units to make them really strong. When it's like, when you look at S tier nations, you don't need to complement your troops that much. They just sort of are naturally that good. Early Age Ulm also has very limited commander options. Your one non-cap only mage is sometimes completely useless. Just like the only thing he's good for is forging or sight searching. Furthermore, Ulm's cap-only mages blow. Like, the Antlered Shaman is good, but he's slow to recruit, and you're getting an Earth 2 mage. It's like you get an Earth 2 mage every other turn. I mean, as far as human troops go, you're the strongest, I suppose. Ulm's Sacred sucks. Really overcosted human guy who just sort of dies to indies. I think they're super one-dimensional. I think they're even more one-dimensional than MA Ulm. So next is TNN. If you watched my MA Iru guide, you can basically sum up all the positives and negatives of TNN. They're practically the same. TNN's just kind of a slightly better version. They have a better sacred. They have better mages. And furthermore, TNN is in an era where lower-ish protection is way more common. Also, as it turns out, having nature is worse than having death or blood. So TNN just gets beat by the other elf nations. Tian Chi is a very, very generic human nation. I would say Early Age Tian Chi is possibly the most generic nation in all of Dominions 5. They don't do anything in particular well, but they kind of do a little bit of everything. And so what that means in practice is they're sort of just bad at everything. Their non-cap mages are laughably terrible. They've got really cool sacreds. I'll say that for sure. I really want to try their sacreds out with big blesses and see what they can stand up against. But strength of the spring is not a buff. That is a nerf. That is a negative trait, not a positive one. And next we have a semi-giant nation that has a lot of different units and a lot of different mages. The problem is their mages they're just not quite good enough for thugging or for being an SC. They're just a little too weak. They're also pretty reliant on getting a fort in a swamp. And granted, if can actually get into death, then that's pretty impressive. I would say becomes a lot stronger if you can pull that off. But again, it's a condition that they now have to meet in the game, and it's absolutely not a guarantee. Or rather, they have air, they have high nature and water. Having high water, though, is not a positive. Let me just get that out of the way. Water magic is not a good thing to have, in my opinion. So I don't think the fact that has high water is a good thing at all. Their sacred dragons are, of course, the most powerful unit in Dominions 5. So we have Abbaseya. Abbaseya can basically be summed up like this. Great blood nation. If you are let to sit around and harvest blood slaves, you have an excellent shot of winning. But 9 times out of 10, that won't happen because your opponent looks at you and says, all right, I cast rain, I defeat your protection, I win. And not really anything you can do about it. You just sort of get killed. Atlantis, the king of the bad water nations. They can compete on land. They just have a really hard time about it. Their mages spend a lot of money, or their mages cost a lot extra because they have high water magic. And again, having high water magic is not useful, at least not for winning the game. It's perhaps useful for winning underwater wars, but it's not useful for getting thrones because most nations in Dominions 5 are land nations. So you're going to be competing against other land nations. So you need a way to beat them, and water elementals are a neat trick, but that's just one trick. They have Holy 3 mages, or they have Holy 3 priests, so they can claim thrones. They can do a throne rush, which is definitely a positive. And living pillars are not a terrible sacred. They have god-awful magic resistance. Yeah, I mean, I think the nation is just decent, and you can win with it depending on the map, but I think you're really starting to push it here. Next water nation is Relay. High water, high astral on their super good mages, but the problem is those mages can't get out of the water. They're stuck underwater, so how do they win the game? They don't really. I mean, they can win if there's a lot of thrones in the water or next to the water. Like, they have really good sacred units, actually. They just can't bring them on land, which just sucks. It's so god-awful. It's just they can't really get on land. And the troops that they can send on land are embarrassing. Speaking of embarrassing, we get to Kailasa. Great astral. You have naked sacred men who just suck. Your commanders are also all naked. It's like even the most feeble of attacks could kill them or cripple them severely. Your armies are composed of weak, pathetic monkeys that will run or die when confronted with any of these nations' troops. All of these nations will beat them. And even some of these nations' troops will beat them. Kailasa may just have the worst troops in the game on land. So you're totally reliant on your mages, but your mages aren't actually very good. They've got sacreds that can be recruited everywhere. So if you're going to win with Kailasa, you've got to take a big dumb bless, and it's got to be explosive, and you got to get out of the gate with it and really power up hard. So I think you can still win with Kailasa with that strategy, but much like Relay and Atlantis, your plan is so simplistic and so easy to counter that it's a bad plan. It sucks. But at the very least, you have a plan. Unlike this nation, Makone has no plan to win the game. They can get very high in all the elemental paths, but elemental magic is not very useful, as it turns out. It's good. They've got good air magic, which would be nice if they had air magic on their important thugs, the pole marks, but they don't. Instead, the pole marks have fire, which is nearly useless, and earth, which is great, but that's really their only redeeming factor, is having high earth on their pole marks. Their Cyclopses with air can be used to thug, but I mean, you're never going to get that many of them. Your capital is constantly being pulled in a bunch of different directions as you're trying to recruit all these different commanders that you all need, but you never get enough of them. And your off-cap mages are just terrible. Your Gigantes are good, but you'll never have that many of them. And your human troops suck. They're just bad. And on top of that, you just get pop kill events and unrest events because. Haha. So next we go to the fabled land of Japan. And Japan during the early age is a land of chaos and turmoil. And Yomi sucks. Yomi is just such an embarrassment, and like Yomi is such a garbage freaking nation. Yomi is the start of what I'd like to call the primitive trifecta, which is to say they cannot make real forts. They can only make primitive forts, which means their most important things, their mages, they get out slower. Not just a little slower, a lot slower than everyone else. Their troops are non-existent practically. They don't have troops. They can get demons, but their demons require temples to be pumped out, which means you have to blow money on infrastructure everywhere. And much like Makone, Yomi gets a bunch of fun-free unrest everywhere, and they also just get reduced income everywhere for fun. They have good death access. The problem is their research is just so terrible, they will never get high death stuff. I mean, really, Yomi is carried exclusively on the back of the Dai Oni, and if anyone has a single brain cell in their head and can figure out a way to beat the Dai Oni, of which there are many, then you just instantly lose the game because you have nothing else. Your demons are terrible. Your goblins are terrible. Your bandits are not even worth mentioning. Yomi does have a lot of cool summons, though, and they're Japanese, so that puts them above other nations that are actually probably better. So Russ also has primitive forts, which means their most important thing, their mages, they get out a little bit slower. But does that actually matter if you're Russ? No, because Russian mages are perhaps the worst mages in Dominions 5. They have the least useful magic paths, and they're not sacred, which means they're going to be eating up your money like crazy. Russ does have great troops, though, and their sacreds, while not the best in the game, are pretty cool. And on your capital, which is, again, a primitive fort, just to remind you, you can get decent thugs. Your per canoes are basically the only thing that redeems your nation. Much like Yomi, you have one good thing about you. The problem is you'll never have enough of them because your forts are all primitive. If you watched my Hinnom game, you'll see that when Russian mages go off script, they rage themselves, and so your expensive cap-only mages will suicide into troop formations where they can be cut to pieces. So Russ just sucks. And now we're in a fierce competition for which nation is bottom of the barrel, the worst nation in Dominions 5 early age. And I'm losing my voice, so I'll go through this quick. Basically, you have Oceania on top, and that is exclusively because Oceania can beat Pelagia underwater. It's not because Oceania has a hope in hell of beating any other nation. They pay a bunch of money to get water on their mages, which is completely useless. And if you take away the water from them, they are left with nothing. They have primitive forts. They can grow ones, but they have to be coastal. And their troops, when they go on land, just suck. Also, their coastal provinces just make less money and get unrest constantly, just for fun. It's sort of like they took everything good about Pangaea and they got rid of it. And they only left the nature part. Pelagia, here at the very bottom. So imagine recruiting a mage from your capital that is Astral 1, Nature 1. It costs 500 gold, and it takes you 2 turns to make it, and it can't go on land. And that's Pelagia. Yeah, I mean, that guy also has Water 4. Who gives a shit? What is Water ever going to do for you beyond Water 1? Like, if you're an underwater nation, you're guaranteed that your water mages are at least 1 level higher with summoned water power. So in what fucking game are you ever going to be making Pearl Kings and thinking to yourself, wow, what a great investment I just made. Now I can have my Holy 3 priests that can't go on land claim all the thrones in a throne rush that I can't do because my units can't go on land. The only units that I can send on land are indie units. I can send my Turtle Tribe warriors or my Shark Tribe Tritons on land, where they just get gutted because they have no protection. They're just fishmen with knives. I don't know what Illwinter was thinking with Pelagia when they're like, oh, this nation is like it's inspired from D&D bestiaries. I mean, yeah, I guess if Pelagia is supposed to be a punching bag, then they're very good at that. They've got a neat feature where they can convert water gems into astral pearls, so you can get really high into astral and nature because that's the only thing your nation can do. But you can like mind blast other underwater nations like Relay. Oh wait, Relay mind blasts you better. Well, I guess you can mind blast Oceania, except Oceania has better troops. You can mind blast Atlantis, except Atlantis has already gone on to win the game. I'm not even convinced Pelagia could actually beat Therados. Like, Pelagia has good sacreds, assuming those sacreds exclusively fight underwater, then they're okay. But they don't have poison resistance, you know? So choke and die on foul vapors from a Telkeen. And so that's it. This is my tier list. I think it is a little flexible here in the B and C tier. Like, I could see some people putting Ulm or TNN in B tier, just as I could see people putting maybe Archaecephaly or Machaca in C, but I think that would be a little rude. Also, perhaps Femoria could be S tier. I'm also considering Saramati as S tier too, but I'm not sure. So I'll link this thing in the description, and if you guys care to make your own tier lists, feel free to make it. You can upload them on my community Discord, and we can have a nice chat, and that's all. Thanks for 100 subscribers, by the way.